You've probably heard a thing or two about Cyberpunk 2077, and you likely have heard some less than savory things. To be fair, I can't for the life of me think of any game in recent or even distant memory that was as anticipated or hyped up as Cyberpunk 2077 was, and this happened for a number of reasons. Obviously, CD Projekt Red had engaged in a long-term hardcore marketing campaign that lasted many years, with each year building up the hype more and more, which created a feedback loop between the hype generated by the company and the hype generated by the fans, with each feeding off of each other, and the years passed, and something almost preternatural had begun to be cooked up in the minds of the fans. And by the lights of what we all knew just prior to the release of Cyberpunk 2077 at the end of 2020, we were, wrongly or rightly, expecting a game that was going to revolutionize gaming for generations to come. It was, despite the genre, the game that was going to change it all and lay down the groundwork for imitators and fans alike, and in some sense it didn't seem all that unlikely. For many people, CD Projekt Red had become an icon of trust and quality assurance, and virtually all of this had been solidified during and after their work on The Witcher 3, with corny and deceptive slogans such as, "We leave the greed to others." At the very least, the promise of the dream of Cyberpunk did not seem all that far removed, given what had seemed to be a reliable track record, and as most of you know, all this came crashing down after the release a little over a year ago, because whatever it was not the groundbreaking game that had been promised, but something else. Not terrible, but far, far from revolutionary. And since all the hype had been built up in something other-dimensional, the ensuing furore from fans, reviewers, and everyone and their cousin was something to behold. Was Cyberpunk 2077 in the broadest sense a failure? No, absolutely not, as it sold very, very well, siphoning off all the hype that had been generated for nearly a decade. But although sales do typically define success for shareholders, they're not always the metric that most captivates consumers. And let's be honest, if Cyberpunk had been developed by a dark horse developer, maybe not a AAA developer, and had suddenly come onto the market, very few people would have felt the disappointment they did. But it wasn't. It had years of overhype that both CD Projekt Red and the fans share guilt in, and was developed by what had then become the darling of the AAA industry, a symbol of trust and professionalism. And in light of that, it certainly fell short. Of course, I could go through the litany of bugs, the PS4 failures, the sheer emptiness of the world, and seeming lack of impact of choices you make, but that's not really what this video is about. And there are plenty of other channels that have covered all that and more. No, this video is about something else. And at this point, I'd like to ask a simple question. Why do we play games? Some people might say to have fun. And that's true, if not a bit oversimplified. One of the primary reasons, perhaps the main reason, to my mind, is escapism. And it's often for this reason that video games come under fire, as a waste of time and symbols of lack of productivity. And in terms of escapism, no genre of gaming better typifies this than the RPG, as RPGs are typically composed of complex layers and elements that exceed the more straightforward genres of games, such as shooters, survival games, and the like. But why do people want to escape? Well, it goes without saying that people would not gravitate towards RPGs as a source of escapism if life itself were such an amazing experience. And though I'm sure that there are perfectly happy people that play RPGs purely for the sheer fun and joy they provide, I kind of think they might be a minority. Now, the big pull of the role-playing game is the fact that you escape the current world you live in and lose yourself in another. But what happens if the alternate world being offered to you in contrast to reality is not a world you particularly want to escape to, because it might be even worse? And at this point, I feel it almost necessary to take a dive into the genre of cyberpunk itself, because it's necessary to understand its roots if we wish to understand one of the more disconcerting and disappointing aspects of Cyberpunk 2077, for much of the player base at least. Cyberpunk as a genre has its roots unsurprisingly in science fiction, but not in any conventional sense. Conventional science fiction, particularly in the early and mid-20th century, was largely a confection of the wildest imaginations coupled by an immense optimism about the future. Rarely did it take into account, for example, the social ramifications of emergent technologies, which is why you ended up with shows such as The Jetsons, which projected forward the social meta of the time, assuming that science and technology would have virtually no effect beyond their promise to improve the lives of the people, and thus the old order was preserved. If the Jetsons stand for a kind of arguably unwarranted optimism, then the works of, say, Isaac Asimov stand in relative contrast to the unbridled vision of positivity that comprised the first half of 20th century science fiction. And I mention this because the alternative vision of the future, a darker, more cautious vision, forms the basis of the cyberpunk genre. And in the series by Asimov called Foundation, the mathematician Harry Seldon, a so-called psychohistorian, has used advanced mathematics to ascertain that the collapse of civilization will soon take place, leading to 30,000 years of darkness, and seeks to preserve civilization and all its science and technology by beginning it anew in something called the Foundation. Now, I don't want to get too much off track, but the reason why I'm mentioning this is because Asimov is presenting a less than optimistic scenario, and this pessimism is foundational to understanding the cyberpunk genre. And then, of course, there's Blade Runner, which appeared in 1982. And this was the first formal presentation of the melding of advanced technology and the dystopian, a world where technology does not exist in a vacuum without social and human consequences, but evolves alongside it, producing frightening results. It asks the question of what it means to be human in a world where that's no longer clear. And of course, after that, we have literary works such as William Gibson's Neuromancer, where the plot follows the idea of criminal hackers working for an artificial intelligence trying to unleash itself upon the world. Megacorporations, hackers, extreme dependence on computer systems, coupled by human misery and decline, are the hallmarks of the cyberpunk genre. And if you come to Mike Pondsmith's Cyberpunk, which was released in 1988, and the setting itself takes place in 2013. And it incorporated all of the dystopian elements mentioned prior: megacorps, crime, depression, but also powerful tech. Cyberpunk is therefore a genre of both skepticism about human progress, but optimism in the sense of our ability to harness and utilize technology in ways beyond our current understanding. And Mike Pondsmith, for example, when asked about its creation, has stated multiple times that cyberpunk exists as a warning about the future, rather than as a prophecy. But given that there are certain harsh realities we need to accept about the genre, it would follow that any game released in such a setting would have to reflect that. And here we enter Cyberpunk 2077. I've already acknowledged the issues that almost everyone acknowledges regarding the release and hype of Cyberpunk. These are well known and numerous. But the issue that most interests me is not even really an issue. Rather, it's something inherent to the setting itself. Put in the simplest terms, beyond the bugs, beyond the hype, beyond the sheer emptiness of Night City, most of the players of Cyberpunk 2077 were not ready for its theme and message. The story of 2077 is almost Sisyphean, in the sense that whatever the protagonist V does, he or she will fail. To be sure, not all failures are equal, just as not all endings in the game leave the exact same bitter taste in the mouth. But Cyberpunk 2077 tells a tale of failure, of the grandiosity and vanity of human ambition in the cyberpunk world. And that simply does not resonate with the vast majority of people, let alone the average player of an RPG. Above all, when you're trying to escape a similarly colored world that you actually inhabit. By way of comparison, The Witcher 3, which arguably is CD Projekt Red's greatest legacy, presents a different vision. Yes, there is misery, and yes, there's hopelessness. But in the end, Geralt is offered a chance of peace and happiness, however dark the game sometimes gets. There really isn't anything like that in Cyberpunk 2077, as whatever you do, whatever you decide, you will fail, and there's no escaping that. Cyberpunk 2077 was, and is, certainly not a commercial failure, as it made more than enough money. It has had many hiccups, and apparently many improvements. But one thing that cannot be changed, updated, or patched is the story. And let's be honest, the story isn't bad, But for people who have not delved deeply into the lore and world building of Cyberpunk and don't understand its background, it can be extremely off-putting and disappointing, as most stories and RPGs offer some version of a happy ending, some light at the end of the tunnel, and ultimately a conclusion that might leave you satisfied. Games that don't do this often become infamous. Yes, I'm looking at you, Mass Effect 3. But in this regard, I don't think Cyberpunk really did anything wrong. In a sense, perhaps more than in any other way, the game has stayed true to its roots and the vision of Mike Pondsmith, and the tragedy of V's life is a testament to that. Night City presents a vision of chaos and hopelessness, and as powerful and competent as you may become as V, you will ultimately fail and die long before you wanted to. That's hard to come to terms with, especially in an RPG, with the time investment, the connections made. It all leads to different variants of the same outcome, and at best, a bittersweet ending for the player. And in most cases, I would argue, in terms of the audience, who had not been primed for the underlying reality of Cyberpunk, total disappointment and rejection of the story and the game itself. As always, thanks for tuning in. Please like, comment, and subscribe. More to come, and I'll check you out next time.